Rajiv Haté is a personal injury lawyer at Kotak Personal Injury Law. He joins us to discuss this further. Rajiv, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I've honestly, I love traveling like most people do, but I've honestly never signed up for insurance when traveling. Why would you say it's important to do so?
It's a great question, and it's quite often that people have that mindset because, you're going on vacation, traveling to enjoy, and you're not expecting something to go wrong. Unfortunately, life often has unexpected circumstances that occur, and the risk of traveling without any kind of travel insurance is that if you get injured while away, you may not have any kind of coverage for medical bills, and those bills can be quite costly, and not only medical bills, but also if you require accommodations, whether it's, nowadays with COVID, having to quarantine, or even if it's accommodations with respect to traveling, trying to get you back home to Canada. All of those can be quite costly if you are dealing with a serious injury. For example, I did some preliminary research. It shows that in the United States, just our neighboring country, fixing a broken leg could cost $7,500. The average cost of a one-day hospital visit that is not an overnight stay is over $2,600, and the average cost of an overnight hospital stay is $11,700 for one night overnight in the U.S. That's the average cost, across the country. So, it can be quite costly if you were to get injured and you don't have any travel insurance to cover those expenses.
And would you say it's more important to have insurance even these days coming out of the pandemic?
Absolutely. And not only is it more important to have insurance, I think it's extremely important to call the insurance provider and ensure that you have coverage for whatever the purpose of your trip may be that you're traveling for, but also coverage for issues related to COVID-19. If you contract the virus in a foreign country, you want to make sure that if you require medical treatment as a result of that you have coverage for that. And I say that because often insurance policies have various exclusions and limitations. Sometimes those include where they don't cover a communicable disease or something of that nature. So that's where you just want to ensure that you do have the proper coverage in place, especially now with what's going on in the Ukraine. Often policies also don't cover exclusions such as acts of war, insurrection, or acts of terrorism, for example. So if you're traveling to an area that may happen to be near a combat zone and you get, again, injured as a result of something that's due to the combat, you may not have coverage for that either. So, again, that's why I think it is extremely important to have travel insurance when you are traveling.
Now, with our healthcare system here in Canada, and more specifically here in Ontario, we have OHIP. Would anything regarding OHIP cover us in another country?
That really depends on the circumstances that leads to the claim. But often, if the event occurs in another country, OHIP does not cover those fees. Often, it is not something that's covered. When you return to Ontario, then there may be some medical coverage there. But often, when it occurs outside of the country, it's not covered by OHIP.
Now, what if we just stay within our country? Maybe we go to a different province or something. Is getting insurance still important in that circumstance?
I think it is. Again, I think it's important to at least call the provider and find out what kind of coverage that they're willing to offer you and what exactly it entails. Because, again, you just never know. I mean, if it's within Canada, likely you'd have some coverage through the government. If not OHIP, then maybe the federal government will likely help out as a citizen. But, I still think it is important to ensure that you do have coverage with traveling.
Now, if we travel to another country that has a similar healthcare system to ours, like, the UK, for example, would their system cover travelers, or is it only the taxpayers within that country?
I'm not familiar with their system specifically, but typically, just like in Ontario, coverage is usually for citizens of the country or the province or the region, right? So often as a visitor, you don't always have insurance. And I can say that I've got a number of clients that are not from Ontario, and if they get injured here, for example, for students, they do not have OHIP coverage. And even though OHIP will provide them treatment, there's also a large bill that's attached to that treatment. They're going to have to be reimbursed for at a certain point in time.
Now, many people have an insurance policy through their employer, and some of that includes traveling, if you should do that, would that typically be good enough? Like, your typical employment insurance plan?
That's a great question. What I find is that employment insurance plans are usually the basic plans. So the extent to which coverage goes is usually more limited when it's an employer-covered plan. And that's where I would again say contact the provider and find out what exactly is covered. And importantly, what are the exclusions and limitations? Often those plans have exclusions also for something known as a pre-existing condition. So it's important to be of what those are, because if you have one of those pre-existing conditions, you may not get coverage in any event. And so, again, it is important to call and check. Now, often if you have an insurance policy through work, some of them also offer long-term disability benefit policies or short-term disability benefit policies. So that may still be something to fall back on in the event you are injured to the point you're unable to work. At least you could have something to potentially cover your income. But in terms of travel insurance specifically, again, I would just check with the provider, find out exactly what they cover and what are the exclusions and limitations under that respective policy.
Now, if we're not covered through work or we don't, have an existing policy, do we, if I was to leave the country for 7 days, do you know roughly how much I'd be looking at? And I'm guessing there's different plans that cover, different scenarios that you might experience, right?
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't be able to speculate on the cost of a plan simply because every insurance company is different, but every individual is different. They often assess the amount of what they're going to charge you based on your own health and based on your age and a number of factors go into consideration. Also, what is the purpose of your trip? I can imagine if the purpose of your trip is to go, let's say, to a dangerous activity like skydiving, for example, perhaps that insurance might be more expensive than if you're just going to the beach, right? So again, I think there's a number of factors there that would come into play.
Yeah, and that was there's a list of tips here that I have in front of me, and that's one of them. Ensure that your travel and medical insurance is appropriate for the kind of trip and the activities that you expect to enjoy while on that trip.
Exactly, because if you do plan on doing some of those, dangerous activities or more adventurous activities that are more likely to lead to an injury, then you want to ensure, again, that your insurance does cover it. And if it doesn't, and same with you were mentioning insurance through your employer, if it is a basic policy or if there's coverage that's somewhat limited, you can always ask them as well if you could pay more to have some extended coverage. And I would recommend that. It might cost a little bit more, but it's worthwhile because if you do end up getting injured, especially if you're out of the country, it can be very, very costly and very, very stressful to deal with if you have no insurance to help you out.
It also says here, now that the federal travel warning is removed, a properly issued traveler may get full medical coverage if hospitalized outside of Canada due to COVID-19.
Yeah, and so that, again, is going to depend on the policy of insurance and the insurance company itself. But often, when there are federal guidelines in place that are telling you do not travel, right off the bat, insurance companies will use that to their advantage and say, well, we're not going to cover you. There are federal guidelines telling you do not travel. Now that that's removed, they likely couldn't rely on that as much anymore, but I would still just clarify with them to ensure that if you are hospitalized or have issues due to COVID-19, that you would still have coverage for that.
And that you should consider coverage that includes expenses in the case of having to quarantine, such as accommodations, food, or transportation.
Exactly, and that's what I was referring to earlier, that if you are having to quarantine, you might end up having to stay in a hotel or somewhere for 5 to 10 days. That can be quite costly. And also having to travel back to Canada, that could also be costly if, your flight ends up getting canceled because of your injury or illness. And so just ensuring that you have something to cover all of those expenses, it really is in your best interest to do so.
And where are we right now in regards to cruise ships? I thought I saw a story on the news, actually, I think it was this morning, that cruise ships, as long as everybody is vaccinated and whatnot, are allowed to, again, dock in Canada.
From what I was aware of, the government was still advising to avoid traveling on cruise ships outside of Canada because of COVID. If that changed this morning itself, I may not have seen that this morning. But from the last that I saw, that the government was still advising to avoid traveling on cruise ships.
Yeah, and I wasn't paying full attention. You might be right as well, but I remember seeing something on the news this morning about cruise ships returning to Canada. So again, I didn't get the whole story. But anyway, Rajiv, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Rajiv Haté is a personal injury lawyer at Kotak Personal